Dianne Kane is a brilliant clinician, researcher, and is the co-author of two very important books. And by the way, we do have book sales out there, and I'm hoping that Dianne and others, authors here, will sign those books for you. But the two books are FDNY Crisis Counseling, Innovative Response to 9/11 Firefighters, Families, and Communities, and the book Healing Together, A Couple's Guide to Coping with Trauma and Post-Traumatic Stress. Currently, she's an associate professor at the Hunter School for Social Work and assistant director of counseling services for the New York City Department of Firefighters. Following the loss of 343 FDNY members on 9/11, she was responsible for the rapid expansion of trauma and bereavement services to the 15,000 FDNY community, and she continues to serve these populations and others impacted by trauma and disaster. Dr. Dianne Kane.
Thank you. Thank you, James. And I really also want to echo other people's comments about thanking the university for giving us this opportunity to come together this year. I've had the privilege of being part of this conversation before, and it's really astounding to think about the fact that here we are 10 years later. Monica really presented a tremendously rich conceptual framework, and I want to give you the opportunity to kind of hold her comments in your minds, really, as I now try to talk about this event from the experience of one specific population and talk about some of the similarities and differences. In order to talk about how the nature of this event really shaped the psychological reactions of firefighters and EMS personnel and the interventions that we developed to address them over time, it really is necessary to really understand the event from the inside out. What do I mean? It's difficult because the events have been told and retold. For 10 years we've heard about the bravery and the pain and the suffering and the loss, especially of firefighters in our community. So in trying to think about today, I really began to wonder, and ask myself what was really different, what's not been focused on in the media. Both the media and the mental health community have lavished lots of attention on our community. And I have no great inner departmental secrets to convey, I'm sorry to say. But I began to realize that, similar to the work many of us do clinically, that it's really only when you slow down and focus in and walk around in another's experience that you begin to really understand what that is like from the inside. And that's really what I want to try to do for you this morning. The aspects of the event that were unique to our population are really what has shaped our work, and I think and hope that it is what will contribute the most to the lessons learned and what we do in the future. Because what we do know is that any future event, it is first responders, firefighters, EMS personnel, police, and others who will be there on the front lines, who will risk their lives, who will help others. But then, of course, they are the very ones that are going to need our help later on. And how to help them, how to make them available for help, has been a tremendous challenge for all of us. So what were the unique characteristics of the event for us? Certainly the amount of loss, the length and the nature of the recovery event, which was very different. This is not the typical first responder event where you get in and you get out. In fact, it had many more resemblances to an ongoing military operation where it was really ongoing, there was great uncertainty, and perhaps most important, the loss of brothers. The inability to recover remains was a tremendously important aspect of this, and the public and media attention that was lavished upon them. And then, of course, if you think back 10 years, you realize at that time we certainly all were facing many more imminent threats and fear of threats, so that every event they responded to in their normal workaday life felt like the potential next 9/11. In terms of the amount of loss, I want to talk about, it was the largest loss of life of any emergency response agency in history. FDNY started recording line of duty loss in 1865, and at the time of 9/11 there had been a total of 774 deaths, and then on 9/11 we had 343. In a typical year in the United States, there are about 100 firefighter deaths, and that includes departments like FDNY, but also every small volunteer firefighting company in the country. We had 61 work units that lost members, anywhere from 1 to 12 members. Over 70 FDNY members lost a father, a brother, or a son who were on the job as well. 343 is a tremendous number, but it's even bigger to think about it as 3% of our total workforce. So if you take a moment and think about your work environment, the people you see every day or pass in the hallways or ride in the elevator with, and if you're not math phobic, as many of us are, to think for a moment about how many would 3% of your work group be. And if you came back to work on Monday and 3% in your absence had suddenly been lost, how many would that be? And what would that be like for you? The culture of the department is very much, and I'll say more about culture, but one aspect of culture, the culture of leave no man behind. The photos that you see there, you may or may not recall, but it was big news in New York City at the time, in November 2nd, actually, of 2001, when Mayor Giuliani wanted to remove firefighters from the World Center site. And we had a huge face-off of police and fire because the firefighters refused to leave. That belief that you leave no man behind was what fueled their ability to keep working, but it also dictated the need for them to be the primary workers at the site and to keep digging. And 10 years later, it's important to realize, because we know now, of course, more than we knew then. We know both the psychological and the physical health costs of that decision that was made when that decision was reversed and we remained at the site. But there is not a firefighter I speak to who would not support that decision today and who would not feel that despite everything it was the correct decision to make. We'll come back to that later. So as a result of that, the recovery effort for us was a 10-month recovery. We didn't leave the site completely until July 25th of 2002. And that, I think, is probably the single most important determinant in understanding everything for our first responders that went later. The timing, the delay, the illness, the retirement, because the site and working there was enormously stressful in multiple ways. The long hours, the dangerous, chaotic conditions, but also the toxic exposure, and especially the contact, the endless contact with body parts, with personal effects, with decay, dismemberment, the work at the morgue, the work digging, and long, long separation from family. Monica talked a lot about the importance of social support. Because our folks don't live near there, many of them simply didn't go home. So there was a long separation from family, and the forming of a disaster community, which is a very supportive and wonderful thing at the time, and also takes its toll because it creates a trauma membrane, which many have written about, and separates it. It reinforces the idea that we're separate and no one on the outside can understand. And that has tremendous implications in the long-term recovery. This is just a picture of the final procession, which was marked with great ceremony when finally the last of the rescue recovery workers and the family members marched out of the site. Still, as Monica reminded us, with many, many people having no remains. By the time that happened, as a department, we had full department exposure. At the time, we had 13,441 firefighters and EMS personnel, and they had all been exposed to the site. We also had multiple timelines as you talk about a definition of trauma. I mean, PTSD is still a disorder that is defined by timelines. And we had many different timelines and many different traumas. There were those whose trauma was collapse survival. Others, the witnessing of the collapse or the jumpers. For the multitude of our population, it was the severe ongoing exposure at the site. And for still others, it was the work with the family members of the deceased and the funerals, which didn't end until September of '03. And many suffered and had reactions and had trauma lines that dictated across those groups and had participated in multiple aspects of it. So cumulative trauma was rampant. So what did they look like over time? Survivor guilt is probably, I think still to this day, the primary presenting difficulty. Many could not, some still cannot voice relief in being alive, so they joined their brothers in deadness. I'm sure you heard, so the way in which first responders work, it's not at all unusual to work a tour for someone else. So we have many, many people who felt like it was their job to work and someone else died. The traumatic loss, as one guy said to me, I had 30 friends who died that day. I'm not talking about just people I knew. People I would call to have a beer with, watch a game with, hang out with, whose kids I knew, whose family I knew. How do you get over that? You know, the PTSD symptoms that presented early on were across all the typical domains, the arousal symptoms, primarily insomnia and irritability, because for many this was a particularly ego-dystonic symptom. These were kind of, level-headed guys who were pretty calm and fun-loving, and suddenly they were snapping at everyone. The flashbacks and nightmares, which of course contributed to the insomnia, and the avoidance and the feeling of distance and disconnection from others. There were multiple stressors over time, health concerns that led to premature retirement and unplanned retirement. In 2002, we had 3 times the number of typical retirements. The increased vulnerability and isolation of the retiree. The marital fallout, which I'm going to talk more about tomorrow. Wives who said, I feel like I lost my husband on 9/11 also. He's trying to protect me, but he's angry all the time, and I know something's going on. The changing environment, new hires because of all those retirements. There was a constant influx of new people into the department, but there were also a tremendous number of promotions, which is typically a celebrated event. But here it was not celebrated because people felt like I'm getting this promotion because so-and-so died. So the vulnerability around transitions was huge. The department started to collect data on both physical and mental health as early as October 2001. And by February of '02, the entire workforce had been monitored. This included self-report data that was able to kind of track people based on when in the event they arrived, what their exposure had been, and then medical as well as mental health symptoms. By 2002, the symptom clusters that I talked about a minute ago were all evident, and we were estimating 12 to 13% PTSD diagnosis at that time within the department. A number of studies have been published showing that data, especially looking at elevated PTSD risk as differentiated from the diagnosis, because this was data that was culled from self-report. But associated with risk, early arrival, the continual work at the site for more than 4 months, the assumption of non-usual work duties. For many, that meant assuming leadership positions at a time that they were not formally charged with that. And all across the board, any disability retirement. So it really often was a comorbidity being reported, because these were not in the earliest days people who were retired from a PTSD disability, but a physical health one, and yet their risk for PTSD was very, very high. Changes in alcohol use, motivation, exercise, weight gain, functional health showed up as problematic more at home than at the work site. And over 4 years, the first 4 years of the study, this data remained fairly constant. But numbers, of course, only tell part of the story. Most of us like the personal story. And I wanted to just talk about this, not so much from the early days, because I think that we all can understand what it must have been like then, but I wanted to just give you a couple of brief vignettes from very recently. C comes into the office. This is February of 2011, and I just want to quote him. He says, "I know it sounds kind of weird. I read a lot. I was reading a book about Iraq vets, and one guy I was talking about, he was talking about his problems, and I'm thinking, that's me. Sounds just like me. And he's diagnosed with PTSD, and I'm thinking, gee, I don't know. I thought I was okay. I thought I was coping well since that morning, but over the years, my wife says I'm short with the kids, and I wasn't like that before, and I started to wonder if there was something to it. And I'm reading this book, and now there are not so many guys to talk about it with in the firehouse, so I thought I'd come in." And then when he gets teary, note the language, he says, "This is ridiculous, ridiculous. I've told this story 10,000 times. My father-in-law was on the job. You know, my name was on the missing list, and I couldn't get to my wife till 5 o'clock that day to tell her I was okay. And I don't know what else there is to say. It's been so long." But of course, what this is an opportunity to do 9 years later is to put together that this is ridiculous, you know, to connect the emotion with I've told the story 1,000,000 times. And the capacity of these guys to hold on and not put that together for so long is, of course, our challenge in meeting their need over time. Another phone call I got actually a couple of weeks ago. I thought about coming here right away, and then I started feeling better. After that, I retired and I moved away, and I thought I could start over. What's that saying? You can run, but you can't hide. The truth is, I don't have much to do, so I'm back there thinking about that day over and over again. Why I am here with nothing to do, and so many young guys died. So the survivor guilt is right there. And this is someone who had not framed it that way for himself before, only after he slows down and his identity as a first responder helper is put to rest does he start to get in touch with that. He also talks about how the self-monitoring review kicks it up for him. But year after year, they do this annually. He's been able to kind of say, oh, I'm fine, and not get into it. But this very time, he breaks down and so comes in. So the interventions that went on and have gone on for 9 years really followed these themes of loss, long-term mission, and culture. That they needed to be shaped specific to that. And luckily for us, firefighting is a culture that is based on group interdependence. And that can really be exploited. And that's not true of all first responder cultures. There really are differences. So part of intervening for first responders is know your culture and know the difference between cultures. But for us, the fact that firefighters work in groups, think in groups, and care about each other in groups became really helpful. You also need to understand that the need to keep working, to take care of the families, to attend all funerals, and to resist seeing yourself as needing help were all critically important. And that had some basic principles that we used to develop interventions: educate, train, don't treat whenever possible. So psychoeducation is a hallmark of everything we do. I mean, these guys respect authority. They work in authoritarian organizations, but they also see authority as a collaborative process. So if you kind of talk to them, respect them, and educate them, not only for themselves, but from one another. The other thing, and of course we knew this, and this is, I think, generally true in the literature from all mental health post-disaster work, don't expect them to just show up. So we needed to go to them. Monica talked about the use of peers, and of course we rely and always have relied heavily on peers, and also the idea of multiple points of access. What they're interested in is what you want to talk to them about. So the concern for the families of the deceased, their concern for their own families, and their concern for one another. And then, most important, the long-term focus. I thought about the work and do think about it as creating a holding environment, a container, if you will, for the emotion that's overwhelming. And to think about, through our effort, to create a holding environment, to see the organization as a holding environment, and to see the counseling unit and the mental health services within it as part of that. And of course, that was going to look different over time. So the 10-month period in which they were at the site, as one guy said, I did not have time to indulge myself or my feelings, but that would have been an indulgence. So the first obstacle, if you will, the first barrier to possibly providing help was to really convince the organization and the individual that intervention at that time didn't need to interfere with the continued work on mission, but it could support it. Once we cracked that, we were able to really be present. So proximity was really the hallmark of the work. So where were first responders? They were down at the site. So walking around and being present late at night and on weekends, offering silent, visible, caring support. It's that walking up, not saying a thing, but just being able to be there. And to follow their lead. So as they got more organized, we got more organized. And when they began to work the site in finite, definable tours of duty, 2 weeks, 3 weeks on, we were there. We were there at 5 in the morning when they went on, and we were there when they came off. And then they were in the firehouse at the kitchen table. Hanging around, waiting to be needed is what firefighters do, if you think about it, right? And that's what we did. And when they needed to be organized, we were able to put clinicians in 61 firehouses. In the middle, I think you'll recognize that guy from MASH. I think about him as the first firehouse clinician. We had clinicians who worked with us and were trained by us, 61 of them in all of the firehouses that had suffered a loss. And they went there weekly or more and hung around, talked to the guys, and became sort of the firehouse shrink. The third place that everyone was at memorials and funerals. Because we had so many peers, they, of course, were there as well. So the ongoing presence and demonstration of caring, and, of course, how we were judged on how we were going to be available and caring for those families. The concerns for the families, and especially the children of the deceased firefighters, was frantic in the early days. And that created a dilemma because, on the one hand, wanting to help, at the same time understanding that the best help over time was really supporting the widow in her ability to care for her children and feel in charge of them, and to not pathologize what is a normal grief process. So it became incredibly challenging to how to keep the 3-year-old from having to go to the doctor's office because she was sad that Daddy died, and how to help Mom feel competent to take over. And ultimately, we were able to develop a home visiting model program with Dr. Grace Christ and some folks at Columbia, and for over a year, we regularly visited families in their homes, providing interventionists to work both with Mom and with each of the kids. And some data, really interesting data from that project, is in the literature, and more will be coming out. But by offering those services, it increased the kind of visibility that we were seriously there to help every part of our community and to gain trust. Following the closing of the site, we really were supporting the need for a break. these guys needed to go home and they needed to see their own families. And we were able to offer them an opportunity to do that. In July of 2002, we offered a weekend retreat model for members and their spouses. We were able to give them kind of massive doses of psychoeducation so that they could really take a step back and understand the impact of what was going on, that the anger and the distance had a name. It was understandable, it was predictable. But we also did it in the context of giving them an opportunity to step away from the family, to step away from all that had been on, and to give them kind of an R&R timeout. It was also the time for individual stories. Guys needed a break, they needed to go home, but they also needed a break from the kitchen table to get away from the collective story. Every person you talk to after trauma has the story they tell readily and the story they avoid telling. And it's in the privacy and the trust and the relationship of a therapeutic relationship and a one-on-one environment that they could begin to deal with the aspects of story that they had not told, that they had avoided, and to cry the tears that hadn't been cried. The first anniversary was tremendously significant. We began to understand that many guys kind of made deals with themselves privately. For some, they had said, if I'm not okay by the first anniversary, then I'll get help. But for others, they said, if I'm not okay by the first anniversary, maybe I never will be. Maybe I have no hope. And understanding that really allowed us to alter the way in which we could do outreach and our peers could do outreach by understanding that. But going to them never stopped, but now they come to us more. Of course, you know, we do a lot of traditional in-office therapy, individuals, couples, groups. But we also began to integrate physical health and mental health in a way that allowed people to feel less stigmatized by going in because there was physical health and monitoring going on. And we began to really offer complementary therapies, therapeutic yoga, acupuncture, interactive therapies that began to deal with the holding of trauma in the body. You know, we do have many people who have just felt like, well, I talked about it and it's not helped me. And understanding some of the neurobiological work that's going on, the way in which trauma really freezes the body. I mean, these are pretty physical people, and they're used to expressing things that way. So these interventions started early on as outreach efforts, and now continue in the office on a regular basis. We have acupuncture in all our locations on a regular basis, and we also have yoga classes going on, and groups that intermix talk therapy with those modalities. The importance of connections and rituals and giving back, because there was such a slow trajectory of people recognizing their own need for help, we really supported the idea that socialization and support and connection provide opportunities for education and for assessment. So for every branch of our population, we had connection programs, couples connection, which I talked about. For retirees, there was a program of Stay Connected. It brought people together and allowed them to understand and rethink the impact of retirement on their lives. The Kids Connection program for the children, and then family connections for siblings, parents, widows, etc. The photos that you see there, we have an annual tree planting celebration right around the anniversary, and families come to a beautiful park upstate New York in Arrow Park and are able to be rowed across a beautiful lake and plant year after year, come and plant a tree in remembrance. It brings the entire community together. Giving back is something that we began to realize was very important. Many of our folks went to Katrina and helped there. And on the right, you see photos from the Stiller race, the Tunnel to Tower race, which one of the families sponsors. But I don't know if you can make it out. Those are the wounded warriors, and there are strong connections and bonds going on now between many of our folks and the veterans who have been coming back wounded. Anniversaries year after year are both trigger events and also very rich opportunities. Symptoms are remarkably, to me at first, often not connected. People will start not feeling great in August and not really put it together until you say that to them. But it is an opportunity to reflect on the meaning and the place of the event in one's life, and to notice the changes over time, to connect with the past in the present and look towards the future. Outreach opportunities are afforded each year to normalize the reactions, but most importantly, perhaps, to reach those who are still suffering in silence. So what have we learned? Good question. We've always known, of course, that culturally sensitive intervention is really critically important. But to understand first responders is to really have to think about it as both a culture of resilience and a culture of resistance. I think typically we think in one direction or the other. But when you put those two things together, it really does shape what is necessary. First, I think you have to be perceived as part of the culture. That outsiders trying to intervene at a time where people naturally kind of hone in and shrink ranks is a difficult phenomenon. Your expectations of behavior need to really be in line with what we know. They're not going to come. They need to work. They need to mourn. They need to care for others. And thinking about what is meant, they were celebrated in the media so much as heroes. Many guys would say, I've always worn fire department shirts when I work at home. Now I won't put one on because when I go to the grocery store, I'm swamped. To them, they were just doing their job, and the real heroes died. And so if you approach them with the idea that you're talking to a hero, it, instead of being a compliment, in some way is a distancer. Your behavior really needs to be consistent and respectful of their traditions and culture, which means really, very simply, to be interested and curious, but also flexible and transparent, and to demonstrate confidentiality rather than just talk about it. The long-term perspective, I keep coming back to it because it really does take a long time to allow people to trust in you, to want to include you, and if you're going to do that and disappear, it makes it difficult for those who come next. The challenges that an event like this calls on, I think, start from day one and are still with us 10 years later. I come back to the issue of limiting exposure and how we do that or don't do that. As I said, no one to this day thinks it was a mistake for firefighters to deal with the recovery effort to the degree that they did. And yet we need to learn more about the interplay of psychological factors and environmental hazards. And we need to learn more about how to rotate people on and off. Psychological exposure is a tremendous factor and is for mental health providers as well. And managing mental health providers, I think, is a tremendous question and a tremendous challenge. For those of us fortunate enough to work in urban environments where there are so many mental health people available, I think it is incumbent upon us to develop connections and resources ahead of time. Out-of-towners will always come and help, and thinking about the best utilization of out-of-town helpers, I think, is an important thing to do. But to utilize out-of-town helpers who will leave to intervene directly with people who need ongoing help is perhaps not the most efficient and effective way. I also think that for mental health folks, it's really important to understand that the initial feeling and response of I need to do something is often a way to counter our own feeling of helplessness, and certainly something, I think we can all understand and relate to. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the most helpful thing to do for everyone else. So I really challenge you, if you are a mental health provider, in any situation to really be thoughtful and mindful about what you bring to the table and whether the work that needs to be done is your work. This is a very long-term effort, and not everyone needs to be there, and that we need to triage our own resources as well as help other people to do that. Reaching the hard-to-reach, and this is a hard-to-reach population, we need to use response data to really be able to predict and identify those who are most likely going to need the help, and to reach them quickly and efficiently before symptoms are increasingly retractable. But we also need to manage our resources, because many people will not present until much later on. There really is a difference. We talk a lot about delayed onset of symptoms, but there's a difference between delayed onset and delayed presentation. The fact that 9+ years later, almost at the 10th anniversary, it is not at all unusual to be hearing from people who have not done any formal mental health intervention. And we need to have resources available to do that. We're in a pretty fortunate position, but if you think about the trajectory of funding, it has to be made available so that people have those resources available to them when they are ready for that. And we need to learn better how to utilize non-traditional interventions, the complementary therapies, coaching, transitional services, community events, and to get those funded as well. And then I think we've only barely skimmed the surface on how to really harness technology and social media. If you look at what's gone on politically and the ability of social media to create revolution, I think that we really need to re-examine the ways in which we can be using that to intervene more effectively. And we really need to enhance long-term resiliency of first responders and to think of that as a public health issue. I was at a conference recently, a terrorism conference with speakers internationally, and to a person, this was not a mental health conference, but long-term resiliency of responders was a huge topic of interest, and I was delighted to see that. Because while we are a resilient population, high in social support and coping skills and the things that we know that prevent PTSD, our exposure level is tremendously high. And so we really need to figure out, to understand there will be functional impairment. The question is, how do we make long-term mental health assistance accessible in a format and in a way that it'll be utilized, not just after an event, but just build it into the fabric of what these jobs are. And we need, I think, as part of that, to really be mindful and available to deal with subthreshold symptoms. Just looking at PTSD or PTSD risk or any other diagnosable condition ignores many distressing symptoms that are highly responsive to treatment interventions. So we need to really be paying attention to that. So if we integrate physical health and mental health better, it allows us to continue to normalize and destigmatize. This can be done relatively effectively, I think, by self-monitoring exams as part of the physical health routine. But if you're going to assess, you need to have resources. I think there really is great value in integrating the system into the organization, and that the cost needs to be understood as the cost of maintaining a resilient responder workforce. And it must include outreach and education to the family. Because at the end of the day, it is, as Monica said as well, the family and the community at home that really needs to support and take care of the responder. And we also need to build in care for the caretaker and the mental health community. I want to end with a quote from Maya Angelou that I like so much, and it says, "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, it need not be lived again." And I really want to thank all of you who have helped us in our efforts and continue to help us in our efforts over the last 10 years. Thank you very much.